The Galactic Assembly Hall never failed to impress Ambassador Nixis, even after 3 centuries of service. Its crystalline spires reached toward twin purple suns, while fountains of liquid light cascaded down transparent walls. Yet today, something felt different in the ancient chamber. The usual symphony of diplomatic chatter had fallen to whispers, all eyes drawn to the delegation that approached the central podium. Humans. Their arrival had been as unexpected as their method of contact, a simple subspace message requesting observer status. No grandiose announcements, no display of technological prowess, just a quiet request for a seat at the table. Nixis adjusted her sensory membranes, trying to better read the newcomers. As senior diplomat for the Velthari Confederation, she had welcomed countless species into the assembly. But these humans, they defied conventional analysis. "Rather plain, aren't they?" whispered Zrax, her longtime friend, and the Meridian Republic's chief envoy. His metallic scales clinked softly as he leaned closer. No biosynthetic augments, no neural interfaces, not even basic environmental shielding. Indeed, the human representatives seemed almost deliberately understated. They wore simple dark uniforms without rank or decoration. Their ambassador, who had introduced herself as Raven Santos, stood quietly at the podium, waiting for the traditional welcome ceremony to begin. "I find their simplicity unsettling," Nixis replied. "Have you noticed their ships?" Drax's scales shifted to a deeper blue, his species' expression of curiosity. "Unremarkable vessels, efficient design, but nothing exceptional." "Why?" "Exactly. For a species to achieve faster than light travel, they must have advanced technology. Yet they show none of it. It's like watching a Crocs cat pretend to be prey." The assembly's high speaker, a towering luminarch named Vesper, raised his crystalline arms for silence. His voice resonated through the chamber, carried by both sound and light. "We welcome the representatives of humanity to the Galactic Assembly. As is our tradition, you may present your credentials and petition for observer status." Ambassador Santos stepped forward. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying easily despite its soft tone. "The people of Earth thank the Assembly for this opportunity. We seek only to observe and learn from the gathered wisdom of the galaxy." Murmurs rippled through the chamber. No mention of technological achievements. No subtle threats or displays of strength. No attempts to forge immediate alliances. It was unprecedented. The Drachnid representative, General Vorax, his cybernetic implants gleaming under the ambient light, spoke next. "Surely you wish to share your accomplishments, to demonstrate what humanity can offer the Assembly." Santos smiled slightly. "We offer only our attention for now. Is that not enough?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, though Nixis couldn't detect any hint of aggression in the human's tone. She found herself studying Santos more carefully. The way she stood, perfectly still but somehow ready, like a coiled spring waiting to release. "The Assembly traditionally requires proof of technological advancement," Vesper noted, "to ensure new members can contribute meaningfully to galactic society." "We achieved faster than light travel," Santos replied simply. "Is that not sufficient proof?" More whispers, some amused, some concerned. Nixis felt her membranes tingling with anticipation. Something was happening here, something more than a simple diplomatic introduction. The days that followed brought no clarity. The human delegation attended sessions quietly, taking notes on antiquated physical devices rather than using neural recordings. They asked few questions, made no proposals, sought no private meetings with other species. But Nixis noticed things. The way they watched everything with careful intensity. How they seemed to appear in the right place at exactly the right moment to witness key events. Their apparent technological simplicity that somehow never hindered them from accomplishing their goals. "They're hiding something," she told Zrax over evening meal. But what? And why? Her friend's scales had taken on a troubled gray hue. Perhaps they're simply cautious. New species often are. "No," Nixis shook her head, her membranes rippling with certainty. "This is different. They're not afraid or uncertain. They're waiting. For what? Before she could answer, their communication devices chimed simultaneously. An emergency session had been called. The Krell Dominion, an aggressive species from the Outer Rim, had launched an unprovoked attack on a mining colony. As Nixis hurried to the chamber, she caught sight of Ambassador Santos already seated in the observer section. The human's expression hadn't changed, but something in her posture had shifted subtly. The waiting, Nixis realized with sudden clarity, was over. The Krell attack on the mining colony had left the assembly in chaos. Representatives argued endlessly about proper response protocols while the Krell continued their advance. Through it all, Ambassador Santos sat silently in the observer section, taking notes with that same antiquated stylus and paper. Nixis found herself watching the human more than the proceedings. There was something different about Santos today. A subtle tension in her shoulders, a slight narrowing of her eyes. The ambassador was still outwardly calm, but she reminded Nixis of a storm gathering on the horizon. The colony reports heavy casualties, announced Delegate Thrix of the mining consortium, his crystalline form flickering with distress. They request immediate military intervention. The Assembly Peacekeeping Force requires at least 3 solar cycles to mobilize, countered another representative. We must follow proper procedures. In 3 cycles, there won't be anyone left to save. Thrix's voice cracked with desperation. Ambassador Santos stood up. The motion was so unexpected that the chamber fell silent. Observer species never participated in military discussions. It was strictly forbidden by Assembly protocol. Point of inquiry, Santos said, her voice carrying that same calm tone she always used. Does Assembly law prohibit independent actions by non-member species in defense of attacked parties? High Speaker Vesper's luminescent form pulsed with surprise. Observer species are not permitted to intervene in Assembly matters. That wasn't my question, Santos replied. I asked if it was prohibited. There's a difference. Nixis felt her membranes quiver. The human was dancing along the edge of diplomatic protocol with surprising precision. She knew the law well. There was no explicit prohibition because no one had ever imagined an observer species would have the capability or audacity to intervene in military matters. The law is silent on that specific point, Nixis found herself saying, drawing surprised looks from her fellow diplomats. But the spirit of the observer status. Thank you, Ambassador Nixis, Santos interrupted politely. She touched a small device on her wrist, spoke quietly into it, then returned to her seat. Moments later, the chamber's main display lit up with urgent communications from the mining colony. The Krell attack fleet had suddenly withdrawn, their ships racing back toward their own territory. No explanation, no demands, no communication at all. They had simply left. The assembly erupted in confusion. Theories flew back and forth. Had the Krell encountered technical difficulties? Had they been recalled by their leadership? Had something scared them off? Nixis looked at Santos. The human met her gaze and gave a slight nod. In that moment, Nixis understood. Humanity had acted, somehow, in a way no one had detected or could prove. The incident marked a subtle but significant shift in assembly dynamics. The humans continued their quiet observation. But now there was an undercurrent of tension whenever military matters were discussed. Other species began watching the human delegation more carefully, trying to understand what they had done to drive off the Krell. A movement began among smaller worlds to court humanity's attention. Their representatives would approach Santos with hypothetical scenarios or casual mentions of their security concerns. The human ambassador would listen politely, take notes, and say little. They're positioning themselves strategically, Zrax observed during one of their private meals. Building influence without seeming to seek it. Yes, Nixis agreed, but to what end? They could have used the Krell incident to demand full assembly membership, to showcase their military capability. Instead, they pretend it never happened. The answer came 3 cycles later, during what should have been a routine trade dispute. The Mercantile Guild of Proxima had accused the Ventari Collective of claim jumping on an asteroid mining operation. Such disagreements were common and usually resolved through tedious negotiation. But this time, when Guild Representative Jorax threatened to deploy security assets to protect their claim, Ambassador Santos cleared her throat. The small sound somehow carried through the chamber. Jorax fell silent mid-threat. The Guild's ships quietly withdrew the next day. No one officially acknowledged what had happened. The humans had made no obvious threats, taken no direct action. Yet somehow their mere presence was becoming a deterrent to conflict. They're rewriting the rules. Nixis told her memoirs that evening. Not through force or diplomacy, but through calculated inaction. They don't need to prove their power. They're letting others come to their own conclusions about it. She paused in her recording, considering the implications. The assembly had always operated on elaborate displays of strength, complex alliances, and carefully balanced power structures. The humans were dismantling that system simply by refusing to play by its rules. A priority alert flashed across her console. Another emergency session. The Krell had returned, but this time they weren't targeting a minor mining colony. They had launched a full-scale invasion of the Etherian Republic, one of the Assembly's founding members. As Nixis hurried to the chamber, she wondered if humanity would maintain their passive stance in the face of such a dramatic escalation. Somehow, she doubted it. The storm she had sensed gathering was about to break. The Etherian Republic was burning. Holographic displays showed the devastation in stark detail. Great crystal cities shattered by Krell bombardment, millions of ethereal beings fleeing their ancestral worlds. The assembly chamber had never been so silent as representatives watched their oldest member face annihilation. "The Krell demand our unconditional surrender," announced the Etherian Prime Consciousness, its usually brilliant form now dim with despair. "They claim this is retribution for our role in founding the assembly. They intend to make an example of us." Nixis felt sick. The Etherians were peaceful philosophers, scholars who had helped shape the Assembly's principles of cooperation and diplomatic resolution. Their destruction would shake the foundations of galactic society. The Assembly peacekeeping force is still 2 cycles from readiness, High Speaker Vesper reported, his crystalline form clouded with frustration. "We need time, To. Time is a luxury the Etherians don't have," Ambassador Santos interrupted. She had moved from the observer section to stand before the main podium. "I request permission to address the Assembly." "Protocol forgotten in the crisis," Vesper nodded. Santos turned to face the gathered representatives, and Nixis noticed something different in her bearing. The careful passivity was gone, replaced by an intensity that seemed to fill the chamber. "For 6 months, we have watched. We've observed how you handle conflicts, how you respond to aggression, how you protect, or fail to protect, your members. We've seen bureaucracy paralyze action, privilege protect the powerful, and principle bow to convenience." Her voice remained calm, but it carried an edge that made Nixis' membranes tremble. This, she realized, was humanity's true face, finally revealed. "You've all wondered why we came here, why we sought observer status, why we maintained our silence. The answer is simple. We needed to understand if the Assembly could be trusted with power, if you would use it responsibly, ethically, in defense of those who needed protection." Santos paused, her gaze sweeping the chamber. "You have failed that test." The chamber erupted in protest. Delegates shouted about human arrogance, about presumption, about overstepping their bounds. Santos waited for the noise to die down. "Humanity has no interest in galactic politics. We don't want territory or resources or influence. What we want, what we demand, is justice, protection for the vulnerable, consequences for aggressors. If you won't provide that, we will." She touched her wrist device again. "This is Ambassador Santos to Terra Command. Execute Operation Sanctuary." The chamber's displays flickered, showing new images. Massive ships were appearing in Etherian space, human vessels, hundreds of them, emerging from what looked like tears in space itself. They were unlike the simple transport ships humanity had used before. These were clearly warships, their hulls marked with strange symbols that seemed to hurt the eye if viewed too long. "The Krell fleet has 10 minutes to withdraw," Santos announced, her voice now being broadcast across all frequencies. "After that, we will remove them." The Krell Supreme Commander, a hulking figure covered in biomechanical augmentations, appeared on the main screen. "You dare threaten the Krell Dominion. We will crush you as we." Santos muted the transmission with a casual gesture. 9 minutes. The assembly watched in stunned silence as the human fleet took up defensive positions around Etherian worlds. The Krell ships opened fire immediately, their most powerful weapons blazing across space. The human ships didn't dodge. They didn't raise shields. They simply absorbed the attacks. Energy weapons, kinetic rounds, even antimatter torpedoes simply disappeared into their hulls without effect. 5 minutes, Santos announced calmly. The Krell launched their second wave, more desperate now. Planet killer missiles, forbidden by assembly law, streaked toward the human lines. Santos didn't even blink. The missiles vanished halfway to their targets. Not exploded, not intercepted. They simply ceased to exist. 1 minute, Santos said. "I suggest the assembly prepare humanitarian aid for the Etherians. They'll need help rebuilding." "You can't just," the Krell commander began. "Time's up." What happened next defied explanation. The human ships didn't fire weapons in any conventional sense. Instead, space itself seemed to twist around the Krell fleet. Ships began to break apart, not through explosion or destruction, but as if reality itself was gently pulling them into component atoms. In less than 30 seconds, the entire Krell invasion force was gone. No debris, no radiation signature, no trace they had ever existed. Santos turned back to the assembly. "The Etherian Republic is now under human protection. We will be establishing similar protectorates over other vulnerable member worlds. This is not a request or a negotiation. It is a statement of fact." She started to return to her seat, then paused. "Oh, and we're declining assembly membership. We've seen enough to know it wouldn't be a good fit. We'll maintain observer status. Someone needs to watch the Watchers, after all." Nixis looked at her fellow representatives, seeing her own shock and fear reflected in their faces. The humans hadn't been waiting to prove themselves worthy of the assembly. They had been judging whether the assembly was worthy of them. The verdict, it seemed, was in. In the cycles following the Krell incident, the assembly changed. Nixis felt it in every session, saw it in every interaction between species. The comfortable illusions of diplomatic equality had been shattered, replaced by a new reality none of them quite knew how to navigate. Ambassador Santos still attended sessions, still sat quietly taking notes, but now her presence carried weight that made even the most powerful delegates measure their words carefully. The simple dark uniform she wore had become more terrifying than any battle fleet. "We need to establish clear protocols," insisted Representative Drawl of the Commerce Worlds, their cybernetic implants pulsing with agitation. "The humans cannot simply declare protectorates without oversight. There must be rules." "Perhaps," Zrax responded, his scales a thoughtful shade of blue. "You should ask them to stop. I'm sure they'd be interested in your protocols." The chamber fell uncomfortably quiet. No one had yet dared to challenge humanity's self-appointed role as galactic protector. The Krell had vanished entirely, their entire civilization going silent after their fleet's destruction. The message was clear. Opposition had consequences. Nixis found herself assigned to a special committee tasked with studying the human situation. It was, she knew, a futile gesture. How could they study a species that could apparently ignore the laws of physics at will? Yet she took the assignment seriously, if only to understand what this new era meant for galactic civilization. "Ambassador Santos," she said during one of their now frequent meetings, "your actions have created considerable uncertainty in the assembly. Many species fear they might inadvertently trigger human intervention." Santos looked up from her notepad. Still paper, still written by hand, now somehow seeming like a deliberate reminder of humanity's disregard for conventional advancement. Fear isn't always unhealthy, Ambassador Nixis. It can motivate better choices. Is that what humanity wants? To rule through fear? We don't want to rule at all. Santos set down her pen. What we want is very simple: to ensure that the strong cannot prey on the weak with impunity. Your assembly claims to want the same thing, but you've built a system that actually protects the predators. Nixis felt her membranes ripple with denial. The assembly has maintained peace for centuries. No, Santos interrupted gently. It has maintained stability. Those aren't the same thing. You've created a system where the powerful can commit atrocities as long as they follow the proper diplomatic procedures. We find that unacceptable. The truth of it stung. How many times had the assembly watched smaller worlds suffer while debate dragged on? How many species had vanished while protocols were followed? But the implications of humanity's solution were equally troubling. You've appointed yourselves as absolute judges. What gives you that right? Nothing gives us that right, Santos replied. We've taken it. The real question is, what would you have us do instead? Stand aside. Watch the strong devour the weak. Participate in your diplomatic games while innocents die. She shook her head. We tried that approach on our own world. The results were unfortunate. The conversation haunted Nixis. She began researching human history in the limited databases they had provided. What she found was fascinating and terrifying. A species that had nearly destroyed itself multiple times, that had faced extinction through war and environmental collapse, that had somehow pulled itself back from the brink and emerged stronger. They had learned from their mistakes, and now they were determined to prevent others from repeating them. The assembly's power structures began to shift. Aggressive species that had long used military threat as diplomatic leverage found their influence waning. Smaller worlds that had previously been ignored were suddenly finding their voices heard. The humans had created a new balance, maintained not by laws or treaties, but by the simple knowledge that injustice would have consequences. They're rewriting the basic principles of galactic civilization, Nixis told Drax during one of their meals. Not through conquest or diplomacy, but by simply making the cost of misbehavior too high to bear. Drax's scales had taken on a complex pattern she had never seen before, uncertainty mixed with hope. Perhaps that's not entirely bad. When was the last time we had a major war? A genocide? Even piracy is down since they began their patrols. But what happens when they're wrong? When they misjudge a situation? They wield enough power to accidentally destroy entire civilizations. Then we must ensure they don't misjudge. Drax gestured toward where Santos sat across the dining hall, still taking her endless notes. They're still watching, still learning. They haven't stopped trying to understand us. Before Nixis could respond, her communication device chimed. Another emergency session. But this time, it was different. The Assembly's leading powers had called for a vote on a resolution condemning human interference in galactic affairs. As she hurried to the chamber, Nixis wondered if they were about to discover the limits of humanity's patience. She suspected no one would enjoy the lesson. The resolution to condemn humanity was doomed before the vote began. Nixis knew it, just as she knew its real purpose wasn't to change human behavior. This was about fear. The powerful trying desperately to convince themselves they still had control. Ambassador Santos sat in her usual place, still taking notes, but something had changed in her demeanor. For the first time since Nixis had known her, the human looked tired. High Speaker Vesper called the session to order, his crystalline form radiating unusual intensity. The Assembly will now vote on Resolution 47B, concerning the unauthorized military actions of observer species. Point of order. Santos interrupted, standing. Before you vote, I have a message to deliver. The chamber fell silent. Santos walked to the central podium, but instead of taking position behind it, she sat on its edge. A casual gesture that somehow felt more threatening than any display of force. You're afraid, she said simply. I understand that. Finding out you're not the most powerful beings in the galaxy is uncomfortable. Discovering that your carefully constructed system of laws and protocols doesn't actually protect you. That's terrifying. She looked around the chamber, meeting eyes and optical sensors, and sensory organs of every variety. But ask yourselves this: what are you really afraid of? That we'll abuse our power, or that we'll continue using it exactly as we have been? Nixis felt her membranes quiver at the question. She knew the answer, and from the uncomfortable shifting among the delegates, so did everyone else. You're not angry because we've acted unjustly, Santos continued. You're angry because we forced you to confront your own injustice. Every time we intervene, we demonstrate your failures. Every world we protect is one you should have defended. Every aggressor we stop is one you should have contained. She pulled out her notebook, that absurdly primitive paper device that had become the symbol of human inscrutability. We've been taking notes, you see, not just on your technology or your politics, but on your choices, on who you help and who you abandon, on who you punish and who you let escape consequences. Santos opened the notebook, though Nixis suspected it was more for dramatic effect than any need to reference its contents. Did you know that in the past cycle alone, the Assembly has ignored 27 requests for aid from member worlds? That you've allowed 3 species to go extinct because helping them wasn't politically expedient? That you've looked the other way while supposed allies conducted illegal weapons research? The accusations hung in the air, made worse by the fact that no one could deny them. You want to condemn us. Santos closed her notebook. Go ahead. But understand this: we're not going to change. We're not going to step back. We're not going to let the powerful prey on the weak just because it's politically convenient. She stood, her voice taking on an edge that made Nixis's membranes curl. But we're also not going to take control. That's what really frustrates you, isn't it? We have the power to rule the galaxy, and we simply don't want to. It contradicts everything you believe about how power works. The truth of it struck Nixis like a physical blow. The Assembly's mighty had always operated on the assumption that power must be used, that influence must be expanded, that strength must be displayed. The humans violated that basic principle simply by refusing to play the game. So here's what's going to happen, Santos continued. You're going to vote on your resolution. It will pass, because you need to pretend you still have control. We will ignore it, because we never claimed to be under your authority in the first place. And then everything will continue exactly as it has been. You'll play your political games, and we'll stop anyone from taking those games too far. She returned to her seat, pulling out her notebook once more. We'll keep watching. We'll keep taking notes, and we'll keep acting when you fail to do so. That's not a threat or a promise. It's simply what we are. The only question is whether you'll keep fighting it or finally accept that the galaxy has changed. The voting itself seemed anticlimactic after that. The resolution passed, of course. The powerful needed their gesture of defiance, but everyone knew it was meaningless. As the session ended, Nixis found herself walking beside Santos. Was this your plan all along? She asked. To become the galaxy's conscience? Santos smiled, the first real smile Nixis had seen from her. No. We came here hoping to find allies, equals, partners in maintaining peace. Instead we found. She gestured at the empty chamber. And now? Now we do what humans have always done. We adapt. We protect those who need protection. We stop those who need stopping. And we hope that eventually we'll find those allies we were looking for. She paused, looking at Nixis with an intensity that made her membranes flutter. Maybe we already have. As Santos walked away, Nixis realized that humanity had given the galaxy something it desperately needed, but never knew it wanted: accountability. They were the watchers on the wall, the guardians no one had asked for, but everyone secretly needed. The Assembly would adapt, or it would become irrelevant. The power games would continue, but now there were rules, unwritten but absolutely enforced. And somewhere, On primitive paper notebooks, humans would keep taking notes, watching, waiting, ready to step in when words failed and action was needed. The galaxy had changed forever. And perhaps, Nixus thought, that wasn't such a bad thing after all.